Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back after the coffee hour. My name is Robert Roth. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the USA. I also direct the Cartography lab there and our online GIS programs. Here today, though, I'm representing the International Cartography Association, just like Anthony and Arzu, and want to share a research agenda that we've been working on kind of throughout the pandemic on mobile-first cartography. Here we go. So just quickly, a little background on our commission. Our commission is one of the oldest in the ICA. The commissions are how we organize kind of research agendas.
That's pale.
Can somebody mute Darius? Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Yeah. All right. Shutting you down. Okay. So back to the Use Commission. We've been a commission since 1984. And for those of you unfamiliar with the ICA, the International Cartographic Association, we kind of organize our new initiatives or research agendas around commissions. So when there's an interesting new topic, new development in cartography, we try to assemble first a working group and then have a commission. And so we've been thinking about the map user since 1984. I got involved in 2003 under the chairship of Corné van Elseker at ITC in Twente. And the focus there was on usability and user-centered design. And so thinking about new processes, new methods and techniques for user research. I became chair in 2019, and we rebranded as the Commission on the User Experience with a focus on UI UX design. Who here has heard of the terms UI UX? Okay, so about half the room, that's good. When I was a student, the term really didn't exist. And so I always like to start with a bit of a definition. So when I say the terms UI UX, UI meaning the user interface. And so we're doing cartography, but interactivity is becoming essential to the way that we think about the design of our maps. UX then the user experience, right? And so the X pulling out the X on experience. And our commission is very interested in design. And so thinking about how early in the development process we might be sketching, tinkering, but then also after the process, we become the evaluators of these maps, right? And so UX design encapsulates these issues. And so I also like to think about UI UX as UI as implementing features. And so for those of you that maybe have taken a programming class, you probably focused on the implementation or the coding, right? My argument is that the outcomes of those processes of using those tools is actually far more valuable. We're always trying to search for a tool that doesn't just work, but also works to solve a particular problem, fill a particular need, right? And as we're building this in our commission, this new set of knowledge, we're trying to help you decide how things will work, right? So trying to generate recommendations, guidelines, ideas, concepts, frameworks to help you through this UX design. When I introduce UX, I like to bring it back to my own university. And so I'm from the University of Wisconsin, which is famous not because of me, but for the original A. Robinson, Arthur Robinson, who, if you have heard of him, you probably heard of him for his map projection, the Robinson compromise projection that he was famous for. But he was also, in a lot of ways, the grandfather of American cartography, bringing the communication paradigm or a more scientific, objective approach into cartography, something that there's absolutely parallels happening in Europe. Robinson is known in kind of America for this approach. And under this model, the idea was that we needed to remove as much of the noise in our design. The map, we had a one-shot chance at communicating our ideas. Or another way of thinking of it as that the designer was trying to put a message in a bottle, right? Throwing it, in this case, across the Atlantic Ocean, so that when it reached the user, the message was as clear as possible. And so this communication was a very one-way dimensional process, right? We had one chance to get it right. Today, we are in what I would argue is a new paradigm of thinking about design in cartography. Rather than in the center of this process where the map was before, the map maybe is on one side of a continuum. And increasingly, it's not just a static graphic, but the map is an interface to a voluminous geospatial database, right? It's how we interact with our spatial data. And so thinking about the interface maybe first and representation second. On the other side of the continua is the user. So rather than having the users at the very end, after we're done with our work, we need to foreground, put the user in the very beginning of the process. And this is a big difference between UI and UX. The interface is just the stuff that we're doing with the map as a designer. But the interaction is somewhat out of our control as designers between this user group and the map interface. And the key critical thing that you hear in UX design is that it doesn't matter how you're using particular tools, right? It's about the experience that you have while doing it. Did you enjoy it? Was it useful? Were you able to complete some kind of work? Do you now know something different as a result? And the interaction, I like to argue, it's also a two-way pattern, right? Unlike Arthur Robinson, where it's a very one-way approach thinking about the user, both the user and the interface can change one another, right? The user, of course, clicks all the buttons and dials, taps on your phone, changes the map. But when these interactions, these experiences are really successful, the new map changes you. It changes the way you think, what you know about the world, how you then behave and act and make decisions in that world. And so this is what UX design is. How do we kind of decenter ourselves as the designer, but try to think through the best support for this sort of interactive user experience? And it's much more than just the interface design. We have to think about this broader set of user needs. So to kind of conclude with my definitions here, UX design to me would be the iterative decisions that lead to a successful implementation of a tool. And my students that are just learning programming always love this part because programming is a difficult skill. They have to say like, yes, it's important, but it's actually not the most important thing to the user, right? Instead, UX design are those decisions that lead to a successful outcome with the tool, as well as a satisfying and productive process leading to that outcome. We want to have enjoyable interfaces versus frustrating ones, which I'm sure we've all experienced. And so in this model that we're trying to enact, this new sort of two-way approach to map design, of course, the computer sits in the middle, right? We're able to interact, to request images in real time, basically the minute we think of them because of our digital devices, right? And they're constantly improving, being able to handle larger and larger data sets. And so we're able to speed this interaction compared to the Robinson era because of the potential of digital computing. And so I want to spend the rest of the talk today thinking about the shift from digital computing in maybe the 1990s or the 2000s to now a mapping user experience that almost is explicitly happening first on your phone. Many of the interactives, the applications that we'll build, that our students will go out and build, need to be able to work on a mobile device, probably first and foremost, right? And so how does that change the way that we think about supporting this user experience? Okay, so I want to do just a quick overview of mobile cartography. And so when we think about mobile maps, right, you probably are thinking like, okay, how did you get to this building, right? How did you navigate your way here? And that's one kind of a way of thinking about mobile maps where we have some sort of location awareness that we can situate the user on the map, right? The current user's location, and then take advantage of all of that context, right? For cartographers, we would say, put the user on the map. There's also non-cartographic applications of location-based services that aren't necessarily map-centric, right? But so thinking about location aware. As a web designer, for someone myself who spent a decade building web maps, but not ones for mobile devices, we're also thinking about new kinds of constraints. And often the biggest one is that this is a pretty tiny device, a tiny screen, compared to like, say, this giant touchscreen, right? This is where we might call something like responsive cartographic design, where we want our maps to work on a regular non-mobile device, but they also have to appear useful, right, meaningful on a mobile device as well. So we're thinking about both contexts. And so the way I like to differentiate these two ideas is that responsive design, thinking cartographically, is how we might change the content and particularly the layout and styling of our web page so that it can be used across multiple devices, right? And so we want to calibrate it or adapt it to the particular display device to optimize it for the display device. What we're going to focus on here for mobile first design is really thinking about not all the different ways that we can adapt to different screen sizes. Well, let's start with the most constrained use case first, right? The situation that is the hardest for us to actually design the map. and then build it out, adapt it from there. And so mobile first design, thinking about the smallest possible screen, the situation where you have almost no battery life left, or you have no signal, and then how do we make the map work out from that design constraint? So just to give you some examples of what these two ideas are, responsive design is supported by web frameworks. And so our website's built in Bootstrap, which is Twitter's responsive design framework that's open source. The idea of responsive design for layout often is column-based. And so Bootstrap uses 12 columns. This visual example just has 8, but it's the same idea. But if you had, say, a graphic, it would get 2 of the columns on the big page, slide to, say, maybe 6 or 8 of the columns. Sorry, you know I was going to do that. Slide to 8 of the 4 of the columns on this page would then be all 8 on the other. And so rather than trying to redesign for every single type of device, you hit breakpoints, right? And things sort of rearrange naturally using this web framework, right? What we're arguing in our commission is that it's much more than just layout, that our map designs now have to take into consideration all sorts of constraints of the mobile experience. And so we have to think about, yes, a small screen. So that's often what changes the layout, but we're also have variable bandwidth, right? Or maybe you have a data plan that when you're traveling abroad in this country, you maximize out before you actually get to your hotel room, right? These are also handheld, and that impacts the way I interact. I'm using my fingers and my thumbs, which are a lot less precise as I was hitting the screen on accident than, say, a mouse. But I can also do new things with the wearable device, like reorient it. I can shake it, right? There's other types of ways I can interact with the map that I never could before, including types of voice input. We also then are moving in the landscape, right? And so that's actually a great enablement. Why we need to take advantage of the ability to capture this sort of user movement. But that also then comes with constraints, right? As you're moving, you're killing the battery, right? Eventually, you're going to have to go somewhere and recharge. You might have variable viewing conditions, right? The map that works in a classroom like this that's darkened might not work outside if it ever does rain here in Vilnius. And then finally, there's also other aspects of you sharing your data in the landscape, whether or not it's just protecting your private data or sharing it on some sort of social media. So as cartographers, we need to take these constraints and then rethink how we, say, choose the default scale, or how we might generalize for our maps, how we might choose a projection or projection centering, how we might configure the visual hierarchy or symbolize our data, how we might choose and place labels on the map, right? And finally, thinking about that UI, we also have to think about new ways we're going to interact because of all those constraints, right? So our commission is trying to work through what are all of these kind of classic conventional things that we talk about in cartography. How do we have to change them, update them for the mobile context? This is a body of knowledge entry. I'm also the section editor of the UC-GIS North American Initiative body of knowledge, where we're trying to compile sort of backgrounds on all new and emerging topics. And I worked with my colleague Britta Rickard to kind of try to synthesize all of the existing recommendations in the literature that are empirically derived, so have some sort of evidence behind them as to why you might want to change a particular design decision. And we see that these have a kind of a natural grouping, again, with sort of scale and generalization, projection, symbolization, typography, all of the classic design decisions that we think through during the design process. And so I can't go through all of these, but take a screenshot or look at my slides or just look at the body knowledge entry. It's free online. I want to use just one example quickly to talk about how we have to think differently about our cartographic design for mobile. This is an NSF, so the U.S. National Science Foundation funded project called Flyover Country, where we're trying to make these large science databases more useful for the general public. In the US and many places, there sort of is the general public is waning in its interest in funding science. And so how can we take all of this hard insight that we've been developing, in this case in the geosciences, and make it more relevant? Well, why don't we design an app around these services when you're in a plane that you can look out your window and see the landscape, right? To be able to interpret the history and the geology of the landscape. And so my lab actually joined after the first version was developed and kind of had failed to a point. I should note, since 2021, this app has been downloaded almost 500,000 times, which for like research software, that's pretty awesome, right? But the first version wasn't working. And the interaction on the left here to focus your attention, you had to click on the map. So first you had to know to click on the map to then register in all of these data sets. And so it's pulling in Wikipedia, it's pulling in large geoscience data sets. A lot of users didn't realize that you had to touch just because that's an unusual interaction in other types of mobile apps, right? There's no visual affordance to tell you to do that. And so for our app, you can still do that traditional way of interacting. But there's also, I'll restart this again. There's also kind of a set of interaction constraint that we walk you through to create your path, right? Looking here, you can now say what data sets that you want. These are all these national compiled data sets, and now moving on to the right, you can type in your flight. Often folks know exactly what call numbers they're going from and to, and so we have an accelerator. And so it's a little slower early on, but people get it, right? And we're trying to overcome a constraint. And so here now you can zoom in and so on. A few things that are different in the overall design. The first was just the base map. We moved away from a light base map into a dark remote sense base map because it saves about 7 times the energy. And so when you're on a plane and you don't have, you're not in first class and you can't just plug your phone in, it matters that your battery life is being drained, right? And so actually using a dark base map, something as simple as that, has a huge impact on the user experience. And we're seeing a recommendation to design sort of for dark base maps. We also are then bringing the UI to be light. So we are using a high visual contrast because of variable viewing conditions, but we're using it sparingly, right? So any of the bright things are the things we want you to click on to draw your attention towards it. In this case, we actually were using a smaller scale. Most mobile apps zoom you into your local context. But when you're flying at 600 miles an hour, 1,000 kilometers an hour, I'm not sure if that's even correct, but you don't need a really localized scale. In fact, the map can't keep up with it. And so the scale is more based on your speed of movement and not any of these other ways that we used to talk about scale and generalization. Another aspect of generalization is that we're giving the user choices to self-generalize because this impacts their data plan. And if I was to scroll down, there's actually a little preview of how many megabytes this download, this caching is going to take up. Because if you have a constrained data plan, you might not want to download every single one of these layers for future exploration. So thinking about generalization more in terms of cost. For interaction, a big thing we're seeing is that in traditional cartographic design, you put your title at the top, right? And that's like a Western reading. You start from the top, you kind of look through the map and then only look at the other sides, right? Well, in mobile, you're looking at your thumb, the pointer. And so the most important thing should be the most accessible thing by your pointing device, right? And so now we're redesigning our interfaces so that everything that needs to be immediately available is accessible with your thumb. And putting it in the center as well so it's not left or right hand biased. Thinking about typography, we're seeing, we used to like load in all these Wikipedia pages, there's just like this giant scroll, but instead we need to be dosing our information. So dividing things up more easily in say a pop-up window. So creating kind of like a card abstract that then has multiple different sort of ways that you might access that eventual text. But also when we think about mobile design, things like tooltips are as important as our map labels. And so how can we design labels for our interfaces the same way we design labels for our map features, right? To help the user understand how to use the system. And for projections, thinking about what's called an egocentric view. There's now vector tiling available that allows you, this is still in kind of a slanted web Mercator you can see, but to trick the user into kind of a front is forward instead of north is up type of view, right? And often this is much more helpful for orienting. So looking out your window saying, okay, what is that landmark if we're actually moving in the direction of travel? So taking into account mobility. So we've been trying to compile these recommendations and we came together in 2019, a total of 66 of us in a workshop just like this. We had 11 position papers read by folks from 8 countries. Some are on this call, hi Arzu, and 5 continents. And we tried to think about what were some of the big challenges facing this mobile first cartography. And after each position paper, we did some whiteboards, maybe we can do some of that later or over lunch or something, to try to think about what are some of the big topics, the things we're not teaching our students, the things we're not researching, right, in say, the ICA. What are the things we need? And as we started whiteboarding, we realized that there were some natural groupings coming together that were very similar to this interaction model. Some were about the design of the map itself, some were about the users and their kind of cognitive limits and their new sort of mobile context, and some were about constraints in just the technology and technological infrastructure generally. So we're a little slowed down during the pandemic, but we're wrapping this summer a set of 3 research agendas where our 3 commissions are each taking on one component of sort of the user experience. I'm going to just spend a few minutes, a couple final minutes, talking about what we're doing in terms of map design. So I'm over there on the right, leading the map design. We've come up with 20 challenges. This is, again, if we have questions, I can come back to this slide, but not something meant to be read directly. I just want to break these down, and all these challenges are like great PhD projects. So if you're a grad student, are looking for something, are interested in like mobile devices, or want to get a job as a UX designer, any one of these would be an amazing PhD project. So the first I've already kind of hinted at, we need to think about generalization in terms of user speed or user cost, and not in terms of like these 20 interlocking scales, right? Our large national databases often have this sort of ladder structure of interlocking scales. What is actually meaningful for different ways in which we move through the landscape, right? And those 20 scales mostly are not relevant to how we're moving. Much of what we have to do for generalization is at the scale of the human body, right? Mobile mapping has kind of changed the way cartography works. Before, there, you would have like go out and survey the landscape so that someone who couldn't be out there and experience themselves has some understanding of that geographic process, right? Now we're in the landscape and we need something new about the landscape we're already experiencing. And so thinking about generalization at the scale of the human body, generalization for indoor and outdoor, there is a huge disconnect in the way we create indoor and outdoor data sets. And so harmonization or interoperability, really important. And then the screenshot, I'm showing a beta tool coming out from Google on thinking about generalization for mixed and augmented reality. Just because we're super local doesn't mean we need super high resolution data. We already have the world, right? We actually need much more abstracted data. And something like this, I think, is actually more recommended, where it's like a billboard as a symbol instead of like this super complex data set. Thinking about projections, we need more research on egocentric designs, and particularly oblique projections. And so egocentric, a projection from the position of the self, not a projection from the view from nowhere, right? Or the God's trick. And so how can we then, from that perspective, here I've got, if you've seen the movie Inception, sort of the Inception kind of map that is absolutely about your experience in this case of Manhattan, right? Where the projection bends as it gets closer to you. But all aspects of our projection design should change. We can now rotate our device. When I'm scrolling, I'm seeing all of these viral maps that are not optimized for the screen, right? The United States or Europe does not fit on the screen very well, right? Why don't we use a transverse projection? It seems so unusual, but it actually would communicate with much more efficiency and detail if we did something like this transverse projection. And finally, there's a whole suite of projection techniques in InfoViz called focus plus context that as cartographers, we haven't really taken advantage of. These include fisheye lenses, inset and mini maps that kind of float around. And I really love our off-screen benchmarks. This is an old, but I still think really relevant, where you don't have to zoom out, you just get off-screen data as a symbol that's kind of part of the data, almost as if there's like a symbol frame around the screen. Third, thinking about symbolization and hierarchy, we need to be thinking more about the energy that our map designs consume. I'm working with a group from Nanjing Normal University to try to estimate the carbon cost of maps. And we estimate in 1 month, the top 6 mapping apps used in the world use the equivalent of 93 million metric tons of greenhouse gases, which would make it the 65th largest producing country in the world, just from our maps. Our maps are the second most used apps on mobile devices behind text messaging services, right? So there is a huge energy cost that we're not considering in our design, and that relates then to maybe the image, the dark map should be the default, right? But what does that mean for all other aspects of design when we want to be effectively flipping the visual hierarchy as the default display? Another issue is that our maps now travel pretty freely, or in many places freely, across borders, right? And can produce what might not be as culturally or locally relevant or sensitive designs as they should be. And so we're thinking how our icons on the maps can be more dynamic, cross-cultural, and inclusive. And I've invented this kind of idea. We have exonyms and endonyms. So place names that were derived from the location, that's an endonym, or a place name that was derived from typically the colonizer, that's an exonym, right? Why don't we have endocons and exocons, right? So icons that were also derived from both that then could be tested and maybe reused, as well as egocons, the ones that are directly relevant to your own personal experience. And then seeing how maybe endocons should be the default view that helps you as you move into a new place, understand how to move in that place and behave differently from your original cultural background. Finally, we've reviewed in this research article like 300 papers, and 4 are on thematic maps. All the rest is about reference mapping. But of course, most of the maps we see are from a news agency, a thematic map that's viral, right? That's part of this scrolly telling experience. But we have almost zero research cartographically on mobile thematic map design. And thinking about how we represent in thematic maps, not just visually, but how can we, when people can't directly look at the device, but can still be using it in some way, make our representations non-intrusive, non-visuals, maybe sonic, maybe haptic. This is research from Amy Griffin, one of our colleagues and sponsors of this event, looking at how your device can shape or heat up. I mean, heating up usually is not good when your device does that, but different ways that when you're just holding it and walking it and attending to the real world, you can still be getting information delivered to you, right? That might be, in this case, thematic. Fourth, we're thinking about mobile-first typography and toponymy. Some of this is similar to how we're thinking about icons. So what's the role of the writing system? And how should we be balancing endonym and exonym place names? One that Arzu mentioned earlier today is the ability to use eye tracking devices, which I understand are going to become standard on the next iPhone, where you'll just have a mobile eye tracker that will log you in, but also when you're reading the map, can be delivering labels to you that are relevant to what you're currently looking at. And so this is a video that Arzu shared with me showing a mobile eye tracker trying to semantically make meaning of the real world as you're walking. So this might be like a glass or head apparatus, but you could do something similar and kind of be gazing around, and where you're looking is where you're getting the density of information. Also thinking about labels, not just as like the thing that sits in the preferred position around the map feature, but that gives us alerts, notifications, that helps us navigate helps us use the map in ways that aren't just clarifying a particular map feature. And so thinking about text and mapping together in kind of a new way. Finally, as I run close to time, this is my last slide, thinking about mobile first interaction. And so I mentioned a few different strategies that we're seeing reprojection being much more common on a mobile device. We're seeing things like filtering being a lot less common. And so there's just certain interaction operators or user interface features that are more or less used in a mobile environment. But then also, one thing I didn't mention is that this is like a pull-up menu, right? And so then there's also certain kinds of new buttons that are available in a lot of these development toolkits that we're not talking about in cartography, how they might be applied for maps. Another thing Arzu mentioned earlier is the role of the avatar. The gaming industry, my students tell me, I haven't been able to game since before writing my dissertation. But the gaming industry has a lot of interesting ways in which the user interacts through the avatar to change and manipulate the world. And basically we are an avatar, it's kind of flipped, we are the avatar in the real world for our map, right? And so we could be capturing embodied movements and interactions in ways that could actually manipulate, update the map. And finally, we need to be thinking about beyond the mobile device, right? We haven't even gotten to just your smartphone, or actually beyond the smartphone, and thinking about the really constrained Apple Watch. This is our commission website on an Apple Watch, apparently. You barely get today's event, so not very effective. But also devices that become the scale of the human. So basically, an autonomous vehicle, a self-drive vehicle, is a mobile device that it wraps around you, right? How do you interact with that in the mapping and the navigation related to that sort of interface or that user experience? Okay, so that's all I have. We're wrapping up the agenda, and so it should be available to you before the next ICA, which is in South Africa next summer. But I wanted to give a little preview. Again, great PhD topics. If you want to steal them, I'm happy to talk more.
Thank you very much, Roth. Excellent. Some very good topics, not only for PhDs, but for
For faculty too.
yeah.
But then join our team working.
Yes, yes. So again, you fill some gaps of the discussion that we're going to have after Costas. So questions to also from the Zoom.
I might have muted everyone, so now I don't. If you're on Zoom, I think you can unmute yourself.
I guess all your presentations going to be available.
Yeah, we can make them available to the website.
Okay, so we'll implement the workshop. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you for the wonderful show. And especially in what we're working with the Israeli police force, and we're publishing materials for mobile phones, and we always have a problem with the legend. My ideas are to skip the legend totally.
Yeah.
What do you think about your agenda?
Yeah. So that is a great question about mobile thematic maps that we're not asking. Because typically you think a thematic map needs a legend, right? A reference map usually should be self-explanatory, right? Jacques Verton actually talked about maps to see versus maps to read, and has a very useful discussion on those differences that were never implemented in cartography, because we always had the ability to add the legend, right? Even though we need it, it's there. And so basically we always had maps to read and not to see. But I think there probably are ways to modify the use of the visual variables. You usually need more contrast, you need more simplification for a map to see. You often need to accent the most important things, so letting the user know where right away. But there are these principles in design that we just haven't, we've had the luxury of not needing them yet, right?
Using tooltips.
Yeah, using tooltips. Yep,
Inside
exactly.
the map.
Yeah, so and annotations, that would be, yeah. And so I think there are these kind of tricks that maybe are untested for cartography, but at least suggested by someone like Jacques Verton that we haven't actually really followed up. I know Melian Kroc, one of my colleagues at ITC, is interested in this, but we're just sort of starting there. But I think probably you want to design a map so it doesn't need a legend is the recommendation.
I will share later our methods.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question.
Anyone else? Yes, yes.
I really like the idea of endo icons, exo icons. So how do you think we might collect examples of those? So yes, I think that was the Now project I think you showed. Was that with the toilets?
Yep. Yeah, so
Is there
one.
something else aside from the Now project?
Yeah, the name of it's evading me. I want to say it's visible, but I don't think it's that. That is looking much more at underrepresented groups and how their lived experience never gets communicated. The idea with most icons is that it's the default view from a Western white guy. And so how do we think about an icon design that is much more inclusive? And that usually means not one icon. It's a lot of different icons for the same thing that can be used interchangeably, right? And so we're imagining in the write-up of the paper is like maybe 3 modes where translation can be really beneficial. So it's not as though one is ever wrong. It's the fact that only one is ever present that is the problem, right? But how do we generate these? Yeah, I think that's interesting that I think cartographers could be thinking more as much about the process of doing this as the kind of final output, right? And I know you've done icon work in the past. Yeah, but I think we could still be thinking more about how we might go about, because there might be, national activities that you should have your register of these are our icons, right? But then once you cross a border, you flip into your Endocon library and it's just available, right? There might need to be ways that you can then self-create. We're thinking, if I'm like walking the landscape in my ego icon, I think a picture of something that is very unusual, like there's a man on a barrel downtown. That was like the center of, it's like a restaurant, it's the center of Old Town. It's very just identifiable. I can convert that picture automatically into an icon, right? And then it places that experience that helps me in a particular way. And so I think just having the icons be a single layer is not going to be enough for mobile devices. And there's all sorts of opportunity to be playing with this idea. But for those that are familiar, the Noun project is an open source activity from just an international group of graphic designers to try to come up with an icon of everything, but not an icon, but like all possible icons of anything. And so the toilet becomes one that is often has this binary gender, which we know is not how gender exists, right? And so how can we get to a more inclusive icon design? And one that also might reflect different services like baby changing stations and whatnot, right? And so there's always sort of new ways that we can be symbolizing better. Yeah.
Good. Anyone else? If no, thank you again.